We've been talking quite a bit about the nervous system, so I think it would behoove us to really break down the broader components of the nervous system. So we break the nervous system down very basically into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system consists of only two structures, but they are huge: the brain and the spinal cord. So the brain and the spinal cord make up the central nervous system, otherwise referred to as the CNS. Then we have what's known as the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, and this is everything other than the brain and spinal cord. So it really encompasses all the nerves that are traveling throughout our body. Nerves are bundles of axons and the neurotransmitters and cell bodies associated with them. The peripheral nervous system is broken up into the efferent pathway and the afferent pathway. The efferent pathway is also referred to as the motor pathway, and these are signals that are leaving the central nervous system going out to the peripheral nervous system, leaving the central nervous system, going to parts of the body and activating parts of the body or stimulating parts of the body to do specific things. The afferent is also known as sensory, and this is taking sensory information to the CNS, to the brain and or spinal cord. So if we step on a rusty nail, that sensation is going to be delivered via the afferent or sensory pathway to the central nervous system. If we see a cute fluffy dog, that information is going along the afferent sensory pathway to the central nervous system. Then the central nervous system, the brain and or spinal cord, processes that information and determines what needs to happen. If it's a cute fluffy dog, then the afferent pathway is going to send a signal to our muscles to pet the dog, to hug the dog. So efferent is sending nervous neuron signals, neurotransmitters, to specific areas of the body. The efferent motor pathway can be divided up yet again into somatic motor. Keep in mind, this is the motor pathway. Somatic motor, which is going to skeletal muscle. So we talked about cholinergic fibers going to skeletal muscle, releasing acetylcholine, binding to nicotinic receptors, activating skeletal muscle to cause muscle contraction. And we'll talk about that in much greater detail when we get to the muscular system. Then the other component of the motor pathway is visceral motor. So we had somatic motor. Visceral refers to organs. The visceral motor is also known as the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS. And this is going to organs like the hearts, the GI tract, the eye. This is going to, say, dilate the eye or restrict the pupils. The autonomic nervous system, otherwise known as the visceral motor, will increase heart rate or decrease heart rate. Decreasing heart rate by having acetylcholine bind to myocardial cells to decrease the heart rate, and increasing heart rate is the job of norepinephrine and epinephrine binding to beta cells of the myocardium. So once again, the nervous system, CNS, PNS, peripheral nervous system, has the efferent motor pathway and the afferent sensory pathway. Now let's take a closer look at some of these pathways, specifically the motor pathway or efferent pathway, which is going to be broken down into, once again, the somatic motor pathway, and everything below that is going to be the visceral motor or the autonomic nervous system. One thing I failed to mention when I was talking about the autonomic nervous system or the visceral motor, it itself is divided up into two categories: the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic is known as fight or flight. Parasympathetic is known as rest and digest. So fight or flight, we want to fight, we want to run, we want to be activated, we want to be excited. That's the sympathetic nervous system. Whereas rest and digest is when we're more mellow and other parts of our body that are not needed to fight or flight or to run or to become excited or go surfing, whatever it is. It doesn't have to be something traumatic like fight or flight. But The sympathetic nervous system is going to do things like increase heart rate, dilate the pupils, increase the respiratory rate, whereas parasympathetic, rest and digest, is going to once again activate things that need to do work when we are in more mellow times. It is wrong to suggest parasympathetic shuts things off. It is certainly activating things like the GI tract to facilitate digestion. So once again, the autonomic nervous system, otherwise known as visceral motor, is broken up yet again into sympathetic and parasympathetic. And that's what we have here. We have parasympathetic fibers and sympathetic fibers. So one thing to notice here, we have neurons here, and the cell bodies of all of these neurons are deriving from the central nervous system, either directly from the spinal cord or the brain. When we look at a somatic motor neuron, it goes directly from the central nervous system all the way to our skeletal muscle, and that's what I'm showing right here. In blue, anything in blue is a cholinergic fiber, and these are cholinergic fibers because they are releasing acetylcholine. So a somatic motor neuron, which is a super long neuron going from the spinal cord to all our skeletal muscles in our body, is going to release acetylcholine to the cells of the muscle, not really these big arms, but acetylcholine is going to bind to cholinergic receptors, specifically nicotinic receptors, which are ligand-gated ion channels. Okay, so if we look at parasympathetic, it looks fairly similar, but it has two neurons in series here with a synaptic cleft between these two. The first and second of these neurons on the parasympathetic pathway, that's rest and digest, are cholinergic. We know that because they are blue. They are both releasing acetylcholine. The only difference is at this region right here, which is known as the ganglia. Ganglia or ganglion is singular. Ganglion or ganglia are clusters of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So this is really representing where a ganglia would be. That's not super important for this discussion, but the synapse here is happening in a ganglia, and the presynaptic neuron is releasing acetylcholine. It is binding to nicotinic receptors on the cell bodies or on the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron. This neuron is also cholinergic because it's releasing acetylcholine and binding to the cells of the heart, specifically the myocardial cells, the heart cells, heart muscle cells, but it's binding to muscarinic receptors. So whereas the acetylcholine here and here are binding to nicotinic receptors, at the distal end here, the furthest away from the central nervous system, at the organ, the acetylcholine is binding to muscarinic receptors, and those are G protein linked receptors. If we look at the sympathetic division, the fight or flight, we have two pathways here. Both of them, the cell bodies are originating in the central nervous system. The first one, which by the way, the presynaptic neuron is much longer than the parasympathetic neuron, but this whole pathway is a sympathetic pathway. This is a cholinergic fiber. We know it because it's blue. That's just the color I've drawn it in, but it's releasing acetylcholine. The receptors here are nicotinic receptors. Keep in mind that this neuron right here is not a cholinergic fiber. We know that, one, because I didn't draw it in the same color, but if you look downstream, this neuron is releasing norepinephrine. So that makes this an adrenergic fiber, but this is a great example that the receptors on these dendrites are nicotinic or cholinergic receptors. So presynaptic neuron releasing acetylcholine, binding to nicotinic receptors on an adrenergic fiber, releasing norepinephrine that binds to adrenergic receptors, either alpha or beta. So for example, norepinephrine would bind to beta receptors on the heart to increase heart rate and force of ventricular contraction, whereas that acetylcholine decreases heart rate. Okay, so that's the sympathetic pathway. There is another sympathetic pathway that's very similar, different, and a bit odd. That is to say, we have this presynaptic neuron This whole thing is a sympathetic pathway. This is going to be releasing acetylcholine, and it's binding to nicotinic receptors. But the interesting thing here is this acetylcholine, or this nerve fiber, is actually going to an organ known as the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland sits directly on the superior aspect of the kidneys. But the presynaptic neuron is synapsing with the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla is the interior of the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland is also known as the suprarenal gland. Renal refers to kidneys, supra meaning above. So the adrenal gland has two regions, a cortex, which is on the outside here, and the interior is the medulla. So we have an adrenal cortex and adrenal medulla. The adrenal cortex releases hormones that we'll talk about when we get deep into the endocrine system. The adrenal medulla releases neurohormones, and we call these neurohormones because signaling molecules that travel through the bloodstream like this are known as hormones. But if they're released from nervous tissue, we call them neurohormones. And the adrenal medulla is composed of nervous tissue. And that is why at the outset, I said that this pathway is a bit odd, because we have nervous tissue up here in the brain, in our spinal cord, and on our nerve fibers running throughout our body. But to have this random organ sitting on top of the kidneys that on the periphery is epithelial tissue, but within the center, the adrenal medulla is composed of nervous tissue. And there's neurons in here. They're going to release norepinephrine into the bloodstream, which will go downstream and bind to alpha and beta receptors, which are adrenergic receptors. This is the impact or downstream effect of norepinephrine is the same whether it's released as a neurohormone into the blood or directly from a neuron as a neurotransmitter. So let's talk about the afferent or sensory pathway and link that up to some activity in the release of other signaling molecules. So we have talked about around the 38th or 40th week of pregnancy, the baby gets big enough where the head of the baby is pushing upon the cervix, and that's going to send a nerve stimulus all the way up to the brain, specifically to a region known as the hypothalamus. So we see this nerve fiber depolarizing, going up here to the hypothalamus. And within the hypothalamus, we find this cell body. The axon travels down into a region right here known as the posterior pituitary or the neurohypophysis. Posterior pituitary and neurohypophysis are the exact same thing. They are parts of the overall structure known as the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland hangs off of the hypothalamus, which is a region within the brain or a region within the diencephalon. We've talked about, when we were talking about uterine contractions or contractions of the myometrium, which is the muscle around the uterus, that oxytocin is released from the neurohypophysis. And that oxytocin is going to be released from this neuron, specifically from the posterior pituitary, and travel through the bloodstream to the myometrium to cause the myometrium to contract. And this was the positive feedback example that we talked about in a previous video. And that's going to cause it to contract, cause that baby's head to push on the cervix again, and send another signal up here to the hypothalamus, causing this neuron to depolarize. And to be clear, there's going to be a neurotransmitter released from this nerve fiber binding to these dendrites. Don't ask me what that neurotransmitter is, because I have no idea. But this is an example of the afferent pathway where there's some sort of activity downstream, and that's the stretch of the cervix due to the baby's head pushing on it, sending a signal via the afferent or sensory pathway up here to the brain, activating this neuron to release oxytocin. The posterior pituitary also releases a signaling molecule known as antidiuretic hormone. antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. It's also known as vasopressin. And we'll talk about this in more detail, but the posterior pituitary is also going to release, I'll just do this in red here, into the bloodstream, ADH. This has nothing to do with childbirth or uterine contractions. This has to do with retaining water. A diuretic is something that causes us to eliminate fluid from our renal system. An antidiuretic, ADH, helps us retain water, and that's going to be detected by these dendrites. The dendrites are actually surveilling the osmolarity of our blood plasma, and if the osmolarity of our blood plasma gets too high, that tells us there's not enough fluid volume in our plasma, is going to activate this neuron, cause a depolarization event down this neuron,